Good morning from Singapore. I'm Nigel Lee, one of your
And
co-hosts for this new podcast, and I'm here with my friend Jack Kelley.
good evening, everybody. I'm Jack Kelley, and I'll be your co-host for today's adventure.
Yeah, so
I'm
mhm,
coming to you live from Bozeman, Montana.
all the way in the U.S. So
Yeah.
just to give you guys some background, this podcast. It's called Big Ideas with Nigel Lee and Jack Kelley, or Jack Kelley and Nigel Lee, whichever order you want it to be. Uh, and originally we were thinking of having a podcast where we just blabber on about random stuff, but because we have a shared interest of philosophy, politics, and history, we thought instead of just saying random stuff, we could just talk about something more professional and more up to date with current events and things like that. And the nature of this podcast is more of a casual thing and just hearing what two people of different cultural backgrounds and different political and philosophical backgrounds have to say about what's going on in the world today. If there's anything else you want to add, Jack, go ahead.
There's not much else I would like to add, but yeah, we're not going to be professional lecturers here. We're just going to be having a conversation coming from two different backgrounds, and hopefully you guys find that entertaining or at
Yeah,
least enlightening.
yeah. So without further ado, we'll start with our first episode. And to our listeners, if we do end up having any, uh, feel free to comment or suggest some topics that you deem are relevant that we can talk about, and we'll definitely try to do that. We plan on making this maybe a weekly thing, so we can have 1 week per episode or something. And we're aiming to make each episode about 40 or so minutes. And yeah, so our first topic of this podcast, we were discussing ranging from the history of Marxism and libertarianism and Taoism and even talking about Jordan Peterson perhaps. But today we're going to be talking about nationalism. Nationalism in the 21st century, and is it a force of good or evil? So I posed that question to my friend Jack. Do you think it's a force of good or evil? Like not just in the modern day context, but throughout history. What do you think?
I think that to give it a qualifier, just nationalism universally as being a good influence or a bad influence, is pretty inaccurate. In a lot of cases in history, nationalism arose from a desire for self determination for certain groups under the heels of certain empires or whatnot, believing in the idea of a nation state that is made up of like-minded individuals and forming that and being able to chart their own course, as it were, has been a good application of nationalism. But it has, I will not deny that it has also led to some pretty disgusting results in history, and I don't think I need to name all of them. I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with
Yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah. I, when it comes to nationalism, because personally I'm quite fascinated about it, um, because to me nationalism is actually a force of good, and I think that the mistake here that the media has made, especially in the United States and in Europe, about like nationalism on the rise, with Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. I don't think that is necessarily nationalism, and I don't think that uh, what we saw in Germany or in Italy was necessarily nationalism at that point in time. Um, I was talking to a history teacher from a school in Singapore, and he coined it fanationalism, fanatical nationalism, and I think that is a good way to describe the kind of nationalism that we saw in the past, because it is a fanatical kind of nationalism where it disregards the principles of treating others with human dignity and seeing others as lesser people. And as you said, Jack, nationalism is about a group of people wanting to search for a sense of
For a united sort of umbrella like
correct.
that
Yeah,
holds that group of people together.
correct. And I think
And so like these nationalists would be using that collective identity, but also trying to like impinge on people who aren't part of that collective identity, that don't fit in with the nation that they have described.
correct. And I think that's where we should draw the line. I think the problem, if we do describe nationalism as this kind of evil force, we make people less a desire, like we make people want nationalism less, and I think nationalism is very fundamental to the survival of a nation. I mean, that's why it's called nationalism. Like, in the US, nationalism, to me, if I were to say what the ideal nationalism is, it is about upholding the Constitution. It is about believing in the democracy, protecting the republic. You know, that's what nationalism should be. And in Singapore, nationalism should be about, you know, our pledge, our nation's pledge ends with to build a democratic society based on justice and equality, so on and so forth, and regardless of race, language, or religion. That is what nationalism is in Singapore. It's about multiculturalism because we're such a diverse society. So I think nationalism...
multiculturalism or multi-ethnic society. Like if you have multiple cultures within one society, then that's people who have like different backgrounds that are not miscible to one another, that can't really mix and cooperate. If they are separate cultures, then that could be interpreted as an invitation to conflict between them. And rather than just having a multi-ethnic society with one culture, with one national identity that is, that they try to uphold.
Well, I guess I never thought of it that way. I mean, to me, multiculturalism has always been about living together under one roof, or one nation, and accepting each other's beliefs and cultures, and to an extent maybe practicing or delving into each other's cultural practices now and then. But based on what you have just shared, I think Singapore is a multi-ethnic society. I think when it comes to Singapore, the definition of multiculturalism is very different to that of the United States or Canada, for example, with Justin Trudeau. I mean, that's a whole nother spectrum of
that's
multiculturalism, which I think ties into exactly what we're talking about nationalism, because I think in Canada, for example, with a leader like Justin Trudeau, who seems to be I've read comments on a lot of his Facebook posts. I've read some articles criticizing him for subverting Canadian values and the Canadian identity for the sake of multiculturalism. And nationalism becomes a reaction to that. It becomes a reactionary movement, a sense of revival of what Canada truly is, or what Britain truly is, not part of the European Union or something like that. Now, then that leads me to wonder, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, of course there's a line where you draw where you say, okay, that is clearly racist. But if someone is saying, well, we are a secular nation, we we are clearly a Canadian country or a British nation. We should not be following what the European Union is dictating us to do or something like that. Isn't that fair? Shouldn't a government of a country defend its own citizens first and foremost?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, their primary responsibility is to their citizens, and also the responsibility is to uphold the laws that they have. I mean, this is I don't want to call it a Western belief because it has arose independently in the like China, for example. But the rule of law, that law is something that supersedes like any earthly human desires. That must be upheld, and that like system of enlightenment values is something that should be cherished. And a lot of people, for example, from the Middle East who haven't been living in societies with that have fully embraced the enlightenment values, like through no fault of their own, they are not fully assimilated into that environment. And I think we take it for granted that we live in these democratic societies, and having people who are just being exposed to that, I believe they can be assimilated, but with like the amount that will come into Europe and whatnot, that is not a sustainable method of immigrating people from different backgrounds and assimilating them into the national identity. And that's where the sort of ethnic nationalism, like nativism, comes from in Europe and America and whatnot, is because they see that there is this threat almost, and they want to fight back against that for the sake of their own country, whatever they believe their country represents.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree to that. But I think it is also the responsibility of so you mentioned that the reaction of the people is that they see this culture or this foreign culture coming in and they see it as a threat. And I think the problem is that the governments have not been taking enough measures to truly incentivize these foreigners to assimilate into the culture. And I think they ought to, because after all, you come into the country as a guest. You have to follow the rules of the nation first and foremost if you want to be a citizen or a resident of the country. And I think it is a mistake of the government in fear of coming across as nationalistic or fascist or neo-Nazi to try to forcefully assimilate the people. But after all, if you look at the United States, I mean, yes, no doubt the generation of immigrants who came from both Europe and Asia during the time of Great Migration into the country exhibited great amount of racism, but it cemented the point of what America is. You come into the country, you are American. You pledge allegiance to the flag, and not to where you originally came from. You are a new human being. You are reborn as an American, and I think that's what nationalism is trying to fight for. And in regards to where these people come from, of Asian countries or more conservative countries that don't follow Western values, I think it is an excuse of the government to say that we don't follow Western values because we follow our own Asian values. And I think it's just an excuse for the government to perpetuate human rights abuses and oppress their people. And again, that's where the problem of nationalism comes about. If they say that they're protecting their own cultural values, hence they don't follow Western values, which essentially is a very nationalistic principle, is that where nationalism turns evil or bad?
I guess so. In that case, I mean, if you have if you have a government that takes that brand of nationalism as its main policy, but if the people are in disagreement to it, then can you really call it nationalism rather than just a tyranny on the people? And it's difficult to tell with many of these societies because not many people are confident enough to speak out against it or to like try and make any changes, because if they're the only one, it's like the Emperor's New Robes. Have you read that
I
story?
haven't. No. So what is it about?
So basically, the Emperor is approached by this wandering man, this weaver, and he says, "I'll make you the best robe ever." And he says, like, only people who are incompetent or corrupt, they won't see it. It'll be invisible to them. And so then he pretends to be weaving a robe for him, and he pretends to drape it over him, but he doesn't like say, "Hey, you're not making anything," because he doesn't want to, call himself as incompetent. He doesn't want to expose himself. So he just goes along with it, pretending it's there. All of his nobles and his court, they don't want to call out that for the same fear. And then eventually he goes out parading naked, but no one wants to like call out that because they don't want to expose themselves if they're wrong, or expose themselves to being incompetent. But then one child like yells out, "He's naked," and then everyone else is like, "Well, he is." It just took that one person to speak out who wasn't afraid.
Right.
But so in these situations, it's if one person tries to protest like alone without any people backing them up, they'll just get arrested and then put in jail for the rest of their lives, and everyone will forget about them. At least that's what most people think.
Right.
There have been many political prisoners that have gotten a lot of attention for that.
Right. And actually, I wanted to stray off about nationalism necessarily, and you reminded me about this guy that we've been studying throughout the past years. One of our favorites,
Yes.
Amos Yee.
Yes.
Oh
yes.
See, the thing about Amos Yee and individuals like him, they come across very bombastic, very unintellectual, perhaps, or
immature,
vulgar,
sophomoric.
Yeah, but at the same time, they also do preach how the country can be better, and does that make him more of a patriot if you are trying to see your country in a better position? And just to give some context to our international listeners, so Amos Yee, search him up. He is a blogger, YouTuber, who made a very controversial video after the death of our first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. And he basically celebrated about the former Prime Minister's death because he saw him as a dictator or something like that. So he was well known for that infamously. But that's where I want to think. Is he a patriot? Did he want what's best for the country?
I think that it is somewhat coming from a patriotic point of view, a desire to change things for the better, because there's not much else that would motivate that video and other videos that followed, particularly ones about the elections in Singapore, and trying to explain to people how they work and how it's a messed up system, and here's what you can do to try and change it, like vote for the opposition and whatnot. Trying to motivate people to expose to them things and just get them to do something and try to change things for the better. And while I think that he did it in a very juvenile manner and he could have done things a lot better, he ultimately, there were some flaws with his presentation, but a lot of the ideas and motivations were noble, and I have to respect him for that. I can't respect him for the things he does now, but at least for what he did then, he was certainly breaking ground.
Mm, mm. I think he's very similar to that kid in that story,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And it just takes one person like that. But I think what he did, his legacy, is very valuable to Singapore because he did open up that discourse, and you know, now Singaporeans, the new generation, the more tech savvy people who do spend their time on YouTube and Facebook, who does take in his content, are seeing this alternative that we can pursue, or this life without the PAP, the People's Action
Yeah,
Party,
like
which is our ruling party.
yeah, the life that their parents lived and that they lived their entire lives, the way that is, it doesn't have to be that way.
Mm.
That there is some kind of alternative. Like, people are unhappy in Singapore, that's a fact, and if they recognize that there are alternatives, and I think Amos Yee did a pretty good job of at least exposing people to alternatives or alternative points of view, then I think they'll be a lot more motivated to try and change things from the rigid way that it is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I wanted to ask you. I want to shift the conversation a bit because I know you are of Irish origin, and you are quite passionate about Irish history, perhaps the more modern parts of Irish history. What do you have to say about
also,
Irish nationalism? And
I mean, it's
mhm.
it's quite an interesting phenomenon because it had kind of existed for as long. Like, the Kingdom of Ireland was, I can't remember the year, but was incorporated into the United Kingdom. They contributed the red X on the Union Jack, and they, like, ever since then there had been like some sense of Irish nationalism. Like, throughout that history, they had not been treated the way that they would have preferred to have treated. I mean, everyone remembers the potato famine and how a lot of people starved to death, like almost all of them, because the British were controlling their trade. They were controlling anything that went in and out and prohibited them from getting cheaper foods and, starving them to death. And there were like lots of rebellions for centuries. And it wasn't until the 20th century where it really, kicked off, that there was actual progress being made, with, Michael Collins and some of the others to establish the Irish Republic. And it's weird because that nationalist movement that actually, broke away was composed of a lot of people of different political beliefs. Like, there were, more like monarchist types, there were Republican types, there were socialists, but they all banded together in the belief that they had to make their own nation and chart their own course. Like, whatever political differences they have, they can discuss and debate that after they are freed from the yoke of the British.
Interesting.
And I think when you get people of opposing political views to unite, like, for example, during the Chinese Civil War, when the Japanese were invading, when you get those two to unite, you can actually get things done.
Yeah.
You can actually move things. And, Ulster didn't really want to be part of this independent Irish Republic. They wanted to be part of the United Kingdom for multiple reasons. The main ones that people often go to is religious, because they were mostly Protestant and the rest of Ireland was mostly Catholic. I mean, that's one of the differences that a lot of people can't really overcome is faith.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I know the Irish flag is very symbolic in that way because of that, like, the green represents the Protestants.
Yeah.
Is it? And the orange represents the Catholics, and the white in between them is like the peace between the two religious groups, which is very fascinating. It was very fascinating.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And you mentioned the Chinese during the Civil War, the oh sorry, the Chinese during the Sino-Japanese War, the second one,
Mm.
and as well as the uh, Irish when fighting for independence. So it seems that national unity obviously comes about in a much stronger way if there is a common enemy. So, which
Mm.
leads me to wonder, and it's been discussed many times, does nationalism or the nation thrive if there is an external enemy or even internal, as we saw with the Nazi regime
Mm.
and the Jewish people and communists, for example.
Mm.
For example, you had the Soviet Union. The threat was the Western capitalist
Mm.
system. For the United States, it was communism, and today, for the U.S., it's uh, radical Islam, as they call it,
Mm.
and possibly the rise of China, the rise of Russia. So, are external enemies necessary for the survival
I
of a
think
nation?
I'm not sure if it's necessary, but it's definitely really good fertilizer for national unity.
Mm,
Because when you have another group that you are in opposition to, then it doesn't matter, the inner debates and squabbles of one nation. You can all band together under one collective identity that is opposed to a different identity and
mm,
use that to your advantage to unite. So, for example, like you brought up Germany, how there were, the Jews and the communists, and that could bring together Bavarians and Bohemians and whatnot, like people who they had slightly different cultures, different dialects of their language, but they still saw themselves as having a collective identity in which
mm.
the Jews and the communists did not fit in with,
Right,
and didn't matter the differences that they had.
right, and our question for today is nationalism a force of good or evil? So does that push nationalism to the more evil side or the more destructive side? Because if progress is only possible on the backs of a group of people who are to be marginalized or identified as a state enemy or a class enemy, then doesn't that make nationalism a force of evil if it does not respect the lives of these people?
I don't. I'm not sure if I have an answer. I mean, I definitely think that it would, in that situation, would be a force for evil being used for more malicious purposes that violate the rights of others. But I'm not sure if that's always inherently evil. Like we mentioned before, with foreign threats that are actually threatening the lives and rights of the people within that nation,
Hmm.
that it is a force for good in that situation. And
Hmm.
I mean, I'd like to go back to my original statement that it's not inherently good or bad, but just how it's used as a tool. But part of me feels like there might be a better answer to that rather than just going for the moderate answer of not inherently good or bad.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so.
Because my roots of being a little edgy objectivist would have leaped for saying that national identity is collectivist and therefore it violates the rights of the individuals and freedoms and whatnot. But I've changed a bit on that and viewing the collective identity as being something that's still useful and could still be helpful to individuals, but also can be, despotic. It could still violate freedoms. It could still alienate people.
Mm.
And so it's difficult to accept a point of view that, or an idea that is correct in all cases when
Yeah,
it comes to these big picture kind of stuff.
yeah. And you mentioned how you used to be more like edgy and more objectivist, I guess, which is interesting you bring up because I think it's also worth discussing how we used to be enemies back in middle school.
Yes. Middle school.
Do you wanna explain that?
The highest of intellectual scholars. As we all know, the greatest philosophers wrote their best works in middle school. So, do you want to start out with sixth grade? Because that wasn't really political. It was just being stupid.
Yeah, I mean,
Eighth grade was
I
the
think
more
that was
political
more of like
conflict.
the harbinger to the greater conflict that was about to happen.
Yes. So
in sixth grade, I posted something like
in German,
on Facebook.
and then I used Google Translate and was like, I don't know, I criticized your German or something because I was
your
a little
German
idiot.
sucks.
And then it was morning before class. It was by the lockers, and then he finds me and like puts his hands around my throat, pushes me against the locker, and it's like, "Don't criticize my German." And then I played up being like choked or whatever because I was in sixth grade and just
you got me a full day in school suspension.
In school suspension from that. But that was just the precursor to what happened in eighth grade.
Yes.
Where I don't remember what started it, but it was on Facebook again.
We were having some kind of debate about communism and capitalism, because I guess that was the fad at that time. And I met you the next day,
yes.
And then I pushed you against the locker, and then you were
again, like dirty move, like a sucker punch, and then we were like, all right, like let's throw down right in front of the principal's office because that's smart. And like all the more jockish kids were like egging us on, like trying to get us to fight, like, oh yeah, dude, like kick his ass, man, like trying to get us more enraged at each other, try and like fight each other. I mean, it wasn't a spectacle to behold.
It was pretty funny because I remember I like extended my hand to you and I said, "All right, let's stop fighting."
Oh yes.
And when we shook hands on it, and when you turned your back, I like elbowed you in the back and I walked away. That was pretty funny. But there are some elements of this story that I really want to point out in the more global, not global context, but more of a political nature. But basically, to summarize, Jack and I ended up becoming good friends in high school and until now, till this day. So that's good.
Yes.
But okay, so there was one thing you mentioned, how the more jockish kids were egging us on.
Yes.
Which is interesting, because if we apply the Marxian perspective of class relations, the Marxists believe that the elite basically have created ideas like racism, nationalism, as a way to egg the different proletarian people on, right? To get them to fight each other so they don't realize that the common enemy is the elite. And so, again, that's, for the Marxists, nationalism is actually a very dangerous thing. It's a very bad thing, because it is, they see it as a product of what the elite tries to use to
try and divide.
People.
To divide the proletarians, so they don't achieve class consciousness.
Correct. And for Jack and I, when we set aside our differences and we started talking about our common values, or even recognizing our differences, and as we are right now, we have different views on what nationalism is. We do see a more productive conversation, a more productive friendship, and I think that's the same with what nationalism, not as a divisive thing, but as a uniting force for a more broader encompassing group of people. not just an ethnicity. Because I think
Yeah.
if nationalism is more ethnocentric, that tends to be more destructive, as we saw with the Germanic people. But if nationalism is more broader, like it is maybe American nationalism, not white nationalism, but the republic,
civic nationalism.
Yeah, correct. I think that's where it can be more constructive, and I think America needs that greatly right now. Some kind of revival of really looking back at its constitutional values and what America really is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I think it's become. I mean, going off that. Here's a bit of a tangent. I think that Western civilization as a whole, they've come to adopt in more recent years a very self-critical look at their own history, for better or for worse. Like looking back on things and saying, okay, we did this. This was not right. We're going to learn from this. But there's an argument to be made that it's reached a point where we often forget, the roots of our societies. Like we forget where we've come from and why it's important that we recognize that, respect some of it, realize some part of it's maybe wrong, but that's why we're in the future and they're in the past.
Right.
And, applying a present lens to the past is always going to lead to identifying problems. So you have to sort of take it with the context and realize that for its time, the ideas were revolutionary and they built the societies that we live in.
Correct.
You can't just ignore them.
And I think to substantiate that, you look at the more modern leftists today, and in America, let's talk about America. They criticize the founding fathers for having slaves, right, and being slave owners, but in reality, they set the foundations for a nation that would give the slaves and then eventually the black people more rights and emancipation. Essentially, they paved the way for. They allowed for that to happen constitutionally. If they truly were really bad people, they would not enable the mechanisms for that to be able to happen.
Yeah, like they set the framework for future progress to be made. Like they put in systems to allow things in the law to be changed, but there were certain ideas enshrined early on that they cannot be infringed, cannot be violated. These things, rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which should be property, but again, because of that slave thing, they changed to pursuit of happiness. But believing in those fundamental natural rights, that's something you can't get rid of, that you can't amend, but there are systems in place to amend things on a national level if necessary.
Right. And I think that's just the natural process of history to try to fix that. And I mean, we're still discussing that today when it comes to the marginalized communities like the LGBTQ community, I mean, right now we have the whole conundrum about gun rights and all that. So I think the fact that the conversation is still in existence is a testament to how strong or how well alive the founding fathers' values still live on in America. And the more Eastern countries or non-Western countries or even other Western countries criticize the U.S. for just continuing to have this sort of discussion and not making much progress. But I think when it comes to that, if you make progress too quickly, you end up marginalizing a group of people. You end up not listening to a group of people. But eventually, when change comes, I mean, you look at the U.S. and when real change happens, it's a real change, right? The civil rights movement, it took 100 years for that to happen. But when that happened, it really changed things up. I mean, sure, attitudes still live on in the U.S. today about black people, but the majority is that you can live a more normal life than you could have hundreds of years ago. So I guess that's my take on American nationalism, is that American nationalism is not your identity, your ethnic identity, but more about associating yourself with a nation that is constantly evolving, for better or for worse. And I think that's where I think nationalism is obviously subjective to the nation, but I don't think it is. I disagree with you that it is a subjective tool, that it can be used for either good or bad, because I think the whole concept of nationalism is more of a principle rather than where it leads to. Because, I mean, you look at Nazi Germany, or even in communist China, where nationalism was used, where nationalism as principle was used to subjugate minority or class enemies or capitalists or landowners, for example, in communist China. They saw it as what was best for their society. And of course, again, that's subjective. But that's the subjectivity of the principles, not the subjectivity of the tool. You know, a screwdriver is meant to tighten the screws of something, but it can be also used to kill someone. But that is not what it's built to do. That's not what it's meant to do. You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Like the principles of nationalism, I mean, it is inherently a good thing. You know, I think, or at least that's the argument that you're giving. But the other principles that are associated with it, that sort of corrupt it in a way, that it can be used, like the principle itself may be good, but it's used for something not good, something nefarious.
Yeah, and I think again that's like
understand
it's like the what the artist can do with the brush. It is who is using the tool.
Yeah.
You know, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine about is the pen mightier than the sword, or the sword mightier than the pen? Because it is we cannot answer that, because it is who is using the pen and who is using the sword. It really it depends completely. So we're coming up to about 43 minutes now. So I guess to wrap it up, I mean, it's a very productive I think a productive conversation is not when you have definite answers, but when you open up more doors. And I think that's what we did today, and I hope we do that more in further podcasts. As we were discussing earlier about how there is something that Jack and I and a few of our friends have been creating. It's a micronation, but I think that deserves an episode of its own. But I think that would be a good continuation of our conversation about nationalism. But we'll do so in the near future. We'll have another episode up in about a week, or maybe even earlier. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. And if you have any other topics or suggestions to make, feel free to do so. You want to add anything, Jack?
Sure. Yeah. If you know, feel free to shoot them our way. You know, maybe on some podcasts we could just warm up answering a couple questions that you guys have had. A little feedback here and there. Then dive into the main topic. But
I could do that.
It's all up to you guys and what you want.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Well, thank you for listening. Have a good day.
Yes,
good
thank
weekend,
you.
A good month, or whatever. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nigel.
No, thank you, Jack. Bye-bye.